Let's join our hearts together in prayer. Holy God, may the words from my mouth and the meditations in all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Amen. There are a lot of sad Jets fans in Winnipeg today. A lot of people walking around feeling low. I imagine a lot of people doing the Charlie Brown walk. I get that. We were pretty low in our house, too. The kids were awake in bed and heard the overtime loss from the sounds of disappointment downstairs. It was a far cry from Game 7 against the Blues, where I was lying with them and knew that they'd won in overtime from the dull roar you could hear through the open window. We had a quiet chat about the emotions of loss as I lay in bed beside them last night. It's funny how so many of us invest a part of ourselves into something that we, A, have no control over, and B, doesn't really affect us in any way whatsoever. And I get it. I mean, folks know I'm a baseball fan. I mean, we watched the playoffs for the Jets, but baseball, that's 162 games. It's twice as many games in a season. And they won yesterday, so that was a good thing. In any major North American sports league, the reality is, unless you win it all, that means your season's going to end on a downer. When you think about it, either you don't make the playoffs or you lose the last game you play. So you've got a 1 in 32 chance of going out on a positive. Still, many of us sign up for that. So I get folks feeling down today. But what does everyone say after the season ends? It's always next year. See, I knew I could trust you guys. There's always next year. And you know what? There is. And people will be back next year. Leafs fans, they keep coming back every year. Masochism, yeah. Before winning the World Series in 2016, the Cubs had a 107-year World Series drought. 107 years before they won the World Series again. Don't get ahead of me. The Leafs have 49 years to match that. 58 years ago. They got 49 years left. So people will be back. And why is that? Because beyond the joy of watching the game, or any game, our hope is grounded in the idea that something different could happen. That there's always next season. And that next season could be different. One of the images that I really like from this passage is that God's dwelling place is among the people. But perhaps a better translation is the word tent. It's that God's tent is among the people. The allusion here is to the tabernacle. That's the tent that the Israelites took with them through the desert as they left Egypt and made their way to the promised land. It was where God dwelled before Solomon built the temple to be the earthly residence of God. But even with that in mind, as we get warmer and warmer weather, as our streets begin to get more and more crowded with people who are homeless, the image of God being in a tent among us, well, that idea sort of has different meaning and different resonance as we see the tents that start to arise in our community. But still, this is a tremendous shift in how we continue to think about things. So often, the language of Christianity is about getting into heaven. But Revelation turns that whole idea upside down. We don't go to heaven in Revelation. Instead, God brings heaven down to earth. And in doing so, God creates something radically new. See, I make all things new. God makes things new. We keep coming back to that idea. It seems like I preach on it every other week. It's like, okay, if God makes all things new, say something new, Tim. But God makes things new. God brings about a new heaven. God does something new by putting a new heaven here on earth. And God does something new not by watching earth from heaven, but by choosing to live on earth with us. And God does something new by living not in a palace, but in a tent. And God does something new not by using overwhelming power, but instead by wiping every tear from our eyes. God is constantly dodging our expectations. See, I make all things new. And this is critical, because the basis of hope is the idea that there can be something new. We cannot have hope without that possibility of change. Without that, then everything quickly turns into despair. In the language of geopolitics, this is why democracy is so critical, that we don't need to be bound to one way of thinking, to one approach to governance. It's why autocracies put the image of their own inevitability at the forefront of their propaganda. To convey that there will be no change is to instill a sense of hopelessness. And yet it's this very hopelessness that Revelation speaks out against. It was written to people who set themselves against the Roman Empire, an empire that was at or approaching the height of its power when this was written. And a small group of people whose lives were under threat, gathering in a tiny little house church, couldn't possibly feel like that great empire that they stood against could possibly be swayed by such a small gathering. I mean, probably less than there are even in this church. Can we feel that? That amongst ourselves we can change the whole world? That's really hard to feel. That's really hard to feel. But Revelation is resistance literature. For people who feel out of control, who felt like they couldn't do anything, it would be easy to throw their hands up in helplessness. And so John of Patmos writes this book saying, wait, look what it says here. See, I make all things new. Today, I think of those immigrants who've been whisked away in the States, living in fear that things will not change, and how critical the possibility of something new needs to be in order to help them get through it. I think of the history of slavery in the world and how scriptural language of liberation in the Exodus remained a critical part of the Christian church in black communities. I think of Israel and Palestine and those people working towards not just a peace, but a just peace, and how their work has to inherently be grounded in the idea that things can get better, despite the overwhelming power and might that pushes back against that very idea. I think of those people who advocate for the climate, for the environment. That's one that's easy to slip into despair in. This past week, we went from 35 degrees to snowing in the space of like 2 days in early May. I certainly come close to that. But it's the idea that change can happen, that there is possibility. That's what hope is grounded in. The last time I preached on this passage, I brought in some jack pine cones, and I burnt them on a hot plate. Does anyone remember that when I did that? And they opened up, and they left that wonderful resin smell in the room. Because that's what jack pines do. Their cones only open up when the forests that they're in burn down. They're among those pioneer species that burst forth even in a desolate and charged landscape. Inherent to the jack pine cone is the idea that there can be change, that the world doesn't always need to be a charred memory of a once beautiful forest, but could be green and vibrant and filled with life. And this isn't just about geopolitics. This is about our own lives as well. I often ask, well, what does any of this mean to us? What does it mean for there to be a resurrection? What does it mean for there to be the promise, I make all things new? How does that affect our lives? Right? For someone struggling with whatever they're struggling with, it is the promise that things can change that keeps us going. Now, they may not change the way we think they're going to change, but that change is always a possibility, is the grounding of our hope. I think of individuals that go to therapy or couples that go to therapy, for example, that ground their hope in the idea that something can change, right? That people keep trying something, hoping something can change. That there can be something that switches, something that helps guide us through whatever that we're going through. When we use the language of addiction, and be clear, we all have addictions, just some of them are more socially acceptable than others. When we recognize them and we struggle to change, though we may backslide, if we keep going, if we keep pushing, if we keep striving to change, it's because we believe that change is possible. That's what hope is. We hope that our lives can be made new because we believe that they can. The basis of hope is that change is possible. And this is what the church is called to be purveyors of. That despite whatever we encounter, whatever the world looks like, whatever is going on in our lives or in the lives of those we meet, that the promise of God rings out in our ears and in our hearts, and as part of the church, it rings out in our voices too. See, I make all things new. So when the world feels just too heavy, or your heart feels just too tired, or the headlines that you read just feel too final, listen again for that voice quietly but firmly saying, see, I am making all things new. And believe it. Because hope begins wherever change is possible. Thanks be to God. Amen.